There is a moment that happens when the last person leaves the room and the door clicks shut behind them. You stand there in the sudden silence, and something inside you doesn't know what to do with itself. The air feels different, heavier, and before you can even name what you're feeling, there it is. That hollowness in your chest that has become so familiar you almost forgot it was strange. You almost forgot that you weren't born with it. You've been carrying loneliness for so long that it has started to feel like a personality trait, like something you are rather than something you're experiencing. And I want you to understand something right from the beginning. This feeling that you've been running from, this emptiness that wakes you up at 3 a.m, this ache that sits with you even when you're surrounded by people who say they love you, it is not your enemy. It never was. It is the most misunderstood part of your existence, and it has been trying to tell you something for years. I remember when I first began to understand what loneliness really was. I had spent most of my 20s doing everything a person is supposed to do to not feel alone. I built friendships, I stayed busy, I filled every silence with noise, every gap in my calendar with plans, every moment of stillness with distraction. And still, there it was, waiting for me at the end of every night, sitting beside me at every party where I laughed a little too loud, following me into every relationship where I gave too much because I was terrified of what would happen if they really saw me. It wasn't until I encountered the work of Jung that I began to realize I had been fighting the wrong battle entirely. Jung understood something about the human soul that most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. He understood that the things we run from are almost always the things we most need to face. And loneliness, that particular suffering that feels so personal and so shameful, is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something within you is trying to wake up. What if I told you that the loneliness you've been carrying is not a wound to be healed, but a doorway to be walked through? What if the very thing that makes you feel most broken is actually the key to becoming more whole than you've ever been? I know how that sounds. I know that when you're in the grip of that ache, the last thing you want to hear is that it has a purpose. But stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you has the power to change the way you understand yourself, your relationships, and the very nature of what it means to be a human being walking through this strange and beautiful life. The loneliness you feel is not random. It is not a malfunction. It is a message. And once you learn how to read it, you will never see your life the same way again. You've been lonely for longer than you admit, even to yourself. There's a version of loneliness that shows up in obvious ways. The empty apartment. The phone that doesn't ring. The weekends that stretch out with nothing but your own thoughts for company. But that's not the loneliness I'm talking about. The loneliness I'm talking about is quieter than that. More insidious. It's the loneliness that sits with you at the dinner table while your family talks around you. It's the loneliness that follows you into your marriage, into your friendships, into every room where you've ever tried to belong. You've felt it, haven't you? That strange sensation of being surrounded by people and still feeling like you're behind glass. Like there's some invisible barrier between you and the rest of the world that you can never quite break through. You laugh when they laugh. You nod when they speak. You perform the rituals of connection with the precision of someone who has practiced them 1,000 times. And still, at the end of the night, you come home to that same hollow feeling in your chest that whispers that you are fundamentally, irreparably alone. I once spoke with a man who had spent 30 years in a successful career, surrounded by colleagues who respected him, clients who depended on him, a wife who had shared his bed for 2 decades. And when he finally sat down and allowed himself to be honest, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said the loneliest moment of his life was sitting at his own birthday dinner, surrounded by everyone who was supposed to matter, and realizing that not a single person at that table knew who he really was. Not because they didn't care, but because he had never let them see. That's the loneliness I'm talking about. The loneliness of living behind a mask for so long that you've forgotten what your real face looks like. The loneliness of performing a version of yourself that you thought would be more acceptable, more lovable, more likely to belong. And somewhere along the way, you lost track of the person underneath. You lost track of yourself. Jung called this mask the persona. It comes from the Latin word for the masks that actors wore in ancient theater. And here is what most people never understand about the persona. It is not inherently bad. It is not a lie you're telling the world. It is a necessary adaptation to social life, a way of navigating the complex demands of being a human among other humans. The problem is not that you have a persona. The problem is that you've confused the mask for your face. You've spent so much energy maintaining the performance that you've exhausted the performer. You've become so skilled at being who others need you to be that you've lost contact with who you actually are. And the loneliness you feel is not about whether there are people around you. It is about whether you are there, whether the real you has been present in your own life, or whether you've been absent from yourself for so long that you don't even know what your own presence feels like anymore. There's a second layer to this that goes even deeper. It's not just that you've hidden behind a mask. It's that there are parts of you that you've pushed so far down, so far into the darkness, that you've forgotten they exist at all. Jung called this hidden territory the shadow. Every quality in yourself that you've rejected, every impulse you've suppressed, every version of yourself that felt too messy or too shameful or too dangerous to show the world, it's all still there, living in the basement of your psyche. And here's the thing about the shadow that will change everything for you if you truly understand it. It is the source of both your deepest suffering and your greatest power. The loneliness you feel is partly the loneliness of exile. Not exile from the world. Exile from yourself. You've cast out essential parts of your own being because you were taught they weren't acceptable. Maybe it was your anger. Maybe it was your sadness. Maybe it was your desire, your ambition, your sensitivity, your wildness, your softness. Whatever it was, you learned early that certain parts of you were not welcome. And so you sent them away. But they didn't disappear. They just went underground. And now they're reaching up through the floorboards, trying to get your attention the only way they know how, through the ache of disconnection, through the hollow feeling that something essential is missing. What if the loneliness you've been running from is actually those exiled parts of yourself, knocking on the door, asking to come home? I want you to understand something about loneliness that almost no one ever tells you. It is not a mistake. It is not evidence that you have failed at life, or that you are somehow less capable of connection than other people. Loneliness is a signal. It is your psyche's way of telling you that something has become fragmented, that some reunion needs to take place. Not necessarily with another person, with yourself. Jung once wrote that the meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow. What he meant is that the path to wholeness does not begin with finding someone else to complete you. It does not begin with more friends, more relationships, more external validation. It begins with having the courage to face the parts of yourself that you have abandoned. It begins in the very darkness that loneliness has been trying to lead you toward all along. I know this is not what you wanted to hear. I know you came here hoping I would tell you how to make the loneliness stop, how to find the right relationship or the right community or the right version of yourself that would finally be worthy of belonging. But I would be doing you a disservice if I offered you another escape. You've tried escape. It hasn't worked. And the reason it hasn't worked is because the loneliness isn't coming from outside you. It's coming from inside. It's the sound of your own depths calling you home. There's a story from ancient Greek mythology that I think about often. It's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was a musician whose playing was so beautiful that it could move stones and calm wild beasts. When his beloved Eurydice died, he did something that no mortal had ever done before. He descended into the underworld to bring her back. He charmed the gods of the dead with his music, and they agreed to let Eurydice follow him back to the world of the living on one condition. He must not look back at her until they had both reached the surface. You know how the story ends. At the very last moment, just as the light of the upper world was within reach, Orpheus turned to look at Eurydice, and she vanished forever. Most people read this as a story about doubt or impatience, or the failure of trust. But there's another way to read it. Orpheus was asked to walk forward into the light while remaining in relationship with something that was behind him, something that was in the darkness. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't tolerate the uncertainty of carrying both the light and the dark at the same time. This is what most of us do with our loneliness. We feel the pull of something in our depths, something essential that has been left behind. And instead of walking steadily forward while remaining in connection with it, we either turn around and get lost in the darkness, or we pretend it isn't there at all, and abandon it completely. Neither approach works. The path forward requires something much more difficult. It requires learning to walk with what lives in the shadows without being consumed by it. It requires a kind of faith in the parts of yourself that you cannot yet see. Jung had a phrase for this journey into the depths. He called it the night sea journey. It comes from the mythological motif of the hero being swallowed by a great sea monster, or whale, and traveling through the darkness before being reborn. Jonas in the belly of the whale. The sun traveling through the underworld at night before rising again in the morning. It is the universal pattern of descent, darkness, and eventual renewal. And this is precisely what loneliness is offering you. Not punishment. Initiation. The loneliness is not the enemy. The loneliness is the invitation. It is asking you to descend into the very depth you've been avoiding, to face the shadow, to reclaim what has been lost, and to emerge on the other side more whole than you have ever been. Let me tell you about a woman I knew years ago. She came to this work after her marriage fell apart and her children had grown and moved away. For the first time in 30 years, she was alone and she was terrified. She told me that the silence in her house was so loud it felt like it was screaming at her. She filled every moment with noise, with activity, with anything that would keep her from having to face that emptiness. But eventually she couldn't run anymore. Her body gave out. She got sick in a way that forced her to stop, to rest, to be still. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened. She began to dream. Not the ordinary dreams of processing the day's events, but vivid, symbolic dreams that felt like messages from somewhere deep within her. In one dream, she was walking through a house she didn't recognize, and in the basement she found a child who had been locked away in the dark. The child was filthy and frightened and hadn't seen sunlight in years. And the woman realized with a shock that the child was her. This is what Jung called active imagination. The process of engaging directly with the contents of the unconscious, of giving the shadow a voice and a presence. The woman in my story began to dialogue with that abandoned child. She began to ask her what she needed, what she felt, what had happened to her. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, she began to integrate parts of herself that had been exiled since childhood. Her playfulness, her vulnerability, her capacity for joy that had been sacrificed on the altar of being a good mother, a good wife, a good woman. When she emerged from that period of solitude, she was not the same person. She was not the woman who had lost her marriage and was terrified of being alone. She was someone new, someone who had descended into her own depth and returned carrying treasure. And the loneliness that had once felt like a prison had become the crucible of her transformation. Maybe for you it looks different. Maybe you're not facing the empty nest or the end of a marriage. Maybe you're young and surrounded by people, but still feel like you're on the outside of some party that everyone else was invited to. Maybe you're in a relationship that looks good on paper but feels hollow at the center. Maybe you've achieved everything you were supposed to achieve, and you're standing at the top of the mountain wondering why you still feel so empty. The specifics don't matter as much as the pattern. Wherever you are in your life, if you're feeling that particular ache of loneliness, if you're feeling disconnected from yourself and others in a way that no external solution seems to fix, then you are being called. You are being summoned to a journey that most people will never take. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't have the courage to stop running. There's a question I want you to sit with. What if the loneliness isn't something to be solved, but something to be listened to? What if, instead of trying to escape it, you turned toward it and asked what it has to teach you? What if the emptiness is not evidence of your failure, but an invitation to fill yourself with something more real than everything you've been using to distract yourself? I know this is hard. I know that everything in you wants to reach for the phone, to make plans, to find some way to not be here with this feeling right now. But I'm asking you to consider another possibility. That the loneliness is not the problem. That the running is the problem. And that the moment you stop running, you will discover that you have been carrying the answer with you all along. If you're recognizing yourself in what I'm describing, I want you to do something for me. Leave a single word in the comments below. Just the word dissent. Not for me. For yourself. As a marker that today, you acknowledged something you've been avoiding. As a declaration that you're willing to stop running and start listening. What I'm about to share with you is not a quick fix. It's not a technique you can apply on Monday and feel better by Friday. What I'm offering you is something much more profound and much more demanding. It is a complete reorientation of your relationship to loneliness. And if you truly take it in, it will change not just how you feel, but who you are. The first thing you need to understand is that loneliness has a wisdom that busyness will never match. We live in a culture that is terrified of stillness, terrified of silence, terrified of the very conditions that allow the soul to speak. Every moment of potential solitude is filled with distraction. We reach for our phones as reflexively as we reach for breath. We scroll through other people's curated lives to avoid sitting with our own uncurated experience. And we do this because, on some level, we know what's waiting for us in the silence. We know that if we stop moving long enough, we will have to feel what we've been running from. But here's what Jung understood that our culture does not. The unconscious does not go away because you ignore it. The shadow does not dissolve because you refuse to look at it. These forces simply go underground, and from there they run your life in ways you cannot see. They emerge as anxiety, as depression, as patterns of behavior you can't seem to break, as relationships that keep failing in the same ways, as a persistent sense that something is wrong that no external success can cure. The loneliness you feel is the shadow knocking. It is the unconscious asking for an audience. And when you learn to stop avoiding it and start listening, something remarkable begins to happen. The very energy that was working against you begins to work for you. I want to tell you about the practice of voluntary solitude. This is different from the loneliness that happens to you. This is loneliness that you choose. It is the deliberate creation of space in your life where nothing external is filling you, where no one else's voice is drowning out the voice of your own depths. When you choose solitude rather than having it forced upon you, you shift from victim to initiate. You transform your suffering into practice. Jung himself understood this. He went through a period in his life that he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years, he deliberately entered into dialogue with the contents of his own psyche. He wrote about his dreams, painted his visions, engaged with the figures that arose from his depths. And out of that intentional descent came the ideas that would change psychology forever. The shadow, the anima, the archetypes, the collective unconscious. None of it came from reading more books or having more conversations with colleagues. It came from sitting with himself, in the silence, and listening to what emerged. You don't have to go as far as Jung did. You don't have to spend years in intensive self-examination, but you do have to create space, real space. Not 10 minutes of meditation squeezed between meetings and answered emails. I'm talking about hours where you are simply with yourself, where you let the loneliness be there without trying to fix it, where you treat the emptiness not as a problem, but as a space where something new might be born. This is frightening. I know it is. The first few times I tried to do this myself, everything in me resisted. My mind raced with all the things I should be doing instead. My body felt agitated and uncomfortable. The urge to distract myself was almost overwhelming. And beneath all of that, there was fear. Fear of what I might find if I actually looked. Fear that the emptiness at my center was real and final, that there was nothing beneath the persona but more emptiness. But I kept going. And here's what I discovered. The emptiness is not empty. It only feels that way because we've never learned how to perceive what lies there. It's like walking into a dark room and assuming it's empty because you can't see. But once your eyes adjust, you realize the room is full. It's full of everything you've pushed away. It's full of versions of yourself that you abandoned long ago. It's full of creativity and longing and grief and power that you never had space to express. The emptiness is not the absence of content. It's the presence of content you haven't yet learned to recognize. The second shift I want to offer you is this. Stop using other people to avoid yourself. This is perhaps the most difficult thing I'll ask you to do, because it goes against everything we've been taught about connection and relationship. We've been told that the cure for loneliness is more people, more interaction, more community. And there's a partial truth in that. We are social beings, and genuine connection is essential to our well-being. But there's a shadow side to this truth that nobody wants to talk about. Many of us use relationships not to connect, but to hide. We use the presence of others to distract ourselves from our own absence. We talk endlessly about surface things, so we never have to sit with the depths. We seek validation from others because we've never learned to validate ourselves. And the result is a strange paradox. The more we surround ourselves with people in this way, the lonelier we become. Because we're not actually there. We're performing, managing, seeking. We're doing everything except being present with what is. Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. He understood that the path to genuine connection with others runs directly through genuine connection with yourself. And you cannot connect with yourself by running away from yourself. You cannot know yourself by constantly filling the space where that knowing would happen with noise and distraction and other people's opinions. There is a form of loneliness that is sacred. It is the loneliness of someone who has stopped looking to the world to complete them and has turned inward to find what was never missing. This is not isolation. It is not abandonment of relationship. It is the foundation that makes real relationship possible. Because when you know yourself, when you have faced your shadow and reclaimed your wholeness, you no longer come to others from a place of lack. You come from a place of fullness. You offer yourself, rather than needing them to fill your emptiness. The third shift is learning to befriend the parts of yourself that loneliness reveals. Remember that I mentioned the shadow earlier. The shadow contains everything you've rejected about yourself. And here's what makes this so important for what we're discussing. Loneliness is often the feeling that arises when you've exiled too much of yourself. When you've cut off from your own anger, You feel lonely in your perpetual niceness. When you've cut off from your own needs, you feel lonely in your constant giving. When you've cut off from your own darkness, you feel lonely in your relentless positivity. The loneliness is the absence of the parts you've pushed away. This means that healing loneliness requires something that feels counterintuitive. It requires going toward what you've been avoiding. It requires asking yourself what qualities you have rejected, what aspects of your nature you have deemed unacceptable, what parts of yourself you have hidden from the world and from yourself. There's a practice I have used in my own life and shared with others that has been transformative. It begins with a simple question. What do you judge most harshly in other people? Think about it honestly. What behavior? What personality trait? What way of being in the world triggers the strongest reaction of disgust or contempt or dismissal in you? Perhaps it's selfishness. Perhaps it's emotional vulnerability. Perhaps it's ambition or laziness or neediness or coldness. Now here's the difficult part. Whatever it is, there is a version of it that lives inside you that you have refused to acknowledge. Jung called this projection. We see in others what we cannot see in ourselves, and the intensity of our reaction is proportional to the degree of our denial. The things that bother us most about others are the things we have most thoroughly rejected in ourselves. This is not about becoming selfish or lazy or whatever quality you've been projecting. It's about recognizing that these qualities, in their healthy form, have a role to play in your wholeness. Selfishness, integrated, becomes appropriate self-care. Emotional vulnerability, integrated, becomes capacity for intimacy. Ambition, integrated, becomes directed purpose. Nothing in the human psyche is purely negative. Everything has a light side and a shadow side. And when you reject the shadow side entirely, you lose access to the light side as well. The loneliness eases as you begin to welcome home these exiled parts. Not by acting them out unconsciously, but by acknowledging them consciously. By giving them a place at the table of your inner life. By understanding that you are large enough to contain multitudes, and that your wholeness depends on including what you have excluded. I want to tell you about a concept that Jung borrowed from alchemy. The alchemists of the Middle Ages were ostensibly trying to turn lead into gold. But Jung recognized that their real work was psychological. The transformation of lead into gold was a metaphor for the transformation of the unconscious, rejected material of the psyche into conscious, integrated wisdom. The alchemist had a saying, in sterquilinius invenitur. It means in filth it will be found. The gold is hidden in the very material we find most repulsive. Your loneliness is that material. The emptiness, the ache, the parts of yourself that you have thrown away because they seemed worthless. That is where the treasure is buried. Not in spite of the darkness, but because of it. The path to wholeness runs through the very experiences you have been trying to avoid. If this is resonating with you, if you're beginning to see your loneliness not as a curse but as a curriculum, I want you to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Think of that person in your life who's going through their own darkness right now, who feels isolated and doesn't know why, who's been trying to fill the emptiness with things that aren't working. Send this to them. Not because I need the views, because they need the words. There's a moment that comes after you've done this work for a while. After you've sat with the loneliness instead of running from it. After you've begun to reclaim the shadow. After you've stopped using other people to avoid yourself and started building a genuine relationship with your own depths. The moment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fanfare or fireworks. It comes quietly in the middle of an ordinary day. You're sitting somewhere, maybe in a coffee shop, maybe on a park bench, maybe in your own living room where you've sat 1,000 times before. And you realize that something has shifted. The ache that used to live at the center of your chest has transformed into something else. Not absence, but presence. Not emptiness, but fullness. You are simply there, in your own body, in your own life. Not reaching for something else. Not wishing you were somewhere else. Not waiting for something to complete you. This is what Jung meant by individuation. The process of becoming who you were meant to be by integrating all the parts of yourself that have been split off and denied. It is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness includes everything. The light and the shadow. The parts you're proud of and the parts that shame you. The persona you show the world and the depths you've hidden even from yourself. I want to tell you about the final stage of the alchemical process. After all the dissolving and purifying and integrating, there comes a moment called the conjunctio, the conjunction. It is the marriage of opposites that have finally learned to coexist within the same soul. The masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious, the persona and the shadow. In psychological terms, it is the moment when you stop fighting against yourself and begin to live as a unified being. People who undergo this transformation describe it in remarkably similar ways. They say that life feels different, not because their circumstances changed, but because they changed. They say that relationships became easier, not because other people got better, but because they were no longer projecting their unfinished business onto everyone around them. They say that loneliness, that old enemy, transformed into something else entirely, into solitude, into a capacity for being alone that was not painful but peaceful, into a relationship with themselves that was as real and nourishing as any relationship they had with another person. This doesn't mean they became hermits. It doesn't mean they stopped needing people or wanting connection. It means they stopped needing people in the desperate, grasping way that had characterized their relationships before. They began to choose connection from a place of fullness rather than seeking it from a place of emptiness. And, paradoxically, this made them more capable of intimacy, not less. Because they were finally present. They were finally there. The mask had become transparent, and what was underneath had become strong enough to be seen. Jung once wrote something that I return to again and again. He said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That sentence contains multitudes. It suggests that who you truly are is not what you started as, not the persona you constructed, not the roles you have played. It is something you become through a process of intentional development, through meeting the shadow, through facing what you've avoided, through descending into the very loneliness you've been running from and discovering there in the depths, the gold that was hidden all along. I want to paint a picture of what this looks like in daily life. Not in some abstract sense, but in the concrete moments that make up a human existence. You wake up in the morning, and there is no immediate urge to check your phone. No desperate need to fill the silence with someone else's content. You are simply present with the morning, with the light coming through the window, with your own breath and the quiet hum of being alive. You move through your day, and you notice when you start performing, when the persona starts to take over, and instead of unconsciously disappearing into the mask, you make a choice. Sometimes you choose to wear it because it's appropriate for the situation. But it's a choice now, not a compulsion. And underneath the mask, you remain. You stay connected to yourself even as you navigate the demands of the world. You encounter difficult emotions, and you don't immediately try to fix them or push them away. You've learned that emotions are not problems to be solved, but messages to be received. You sit with the anger or the sadness or the fear, and you ask what it's trying to tell you.